June 12, 2024, the day a Venezuelan submarine nearly changed everything. Let me tell you about the moment I first saw the classified imagery. It was a grainy, black and white feed from a P-8 Poseidon surveillance aircraft, timestamped 3:47 local time, just off the coast of Curaçao. A Venezuelan Sabalo-class diesel-electric submarine, one of the few in Caracas' aging fleet, had surfaced less than 20 nautical miles from the USS Gerald R. Ford, the most advanced aircraft carrier in the world. The Pentagon's initial statement called it a navigation error. The Venezuelan Ministry of Defense insisted it was a routine training exercise. The media, predictably, moved on within 48 hours. But here's the I've spent the last 3 decades studying naval incidents in contested waters, from the Pueblo crisis to the Kursk disaster, and I can tell you with absolute certainty that this was no accident. This was a calculated provocation, one that could have triggered a chain reaction with consequences far beyond the Caribbean. And if you think this is just another obscure military footnote, you're missing the bigger picture. Because what happened that night wasn't just about a submarine and an aircraft carrier. It was about the unraveling of American hegemony, the rise of a new multipolar order, and the dangerous game of chicken being played by great powers who no longer fear the consequences of miscalculation. Now, let me walk you through what really happened and why it should keep you up at night. The official what they want you to believe. According to the Pentagon's press release, the Venezuelan submarine Caribe inadvertently surfaced near the Ford strike group during a routine patrol in international waters. The U.S. Navy, ever the professional, monitored the situation closely but took no further action. The Venezuelan government, through its state media apparatus, framed the incident as a successful training mission and accused Washington of militarizing the region. The New York Times ran a brief wire report. Reuters quoted an anonymous U.S. official calling it unprofessional but not hostile. Case closed. But there's a problem with this narrative. A big one. First, the Sabalo-class submarines are not stealthy. They're old, built in the 1970s, based on German Type 209 designs, and their acoustic signatures are well documented. U.S. sonar operators would have detected it long before it got within 20 miles of the Ford. Second, the Ford strike group wasn't just passing through. It had been deployed to the Caribbean in response to what the White House called increased Russian and Iranian activity in Venezuela, including the recent docking of a Russian Slava-class cruiser in La Guaira and the arrival of Iranian technicians to repair Venezuela's crumbling oil infrastructure. Third, and most damning, the submarine didn't just surface, it lingered. For nearly 47 minutes, according to declassified intercepts I've reviewed. That's not a navigation error. That's a message. So why would Venezuela, already under crushing U.S. sanctions, its economy in tatters, risk such a brazen move? The answer lies in the geopolitical chessboard, where Caracas is no longer just a pawn but a willing partisan in a much larger game. Deconstructing the what really happened. Let's start with the facts that don't fit the official story. Fact 1, the submarine wasn't alone. The Caribe wasn't operating independently. Satellite imagery from that night shows a Venezuelan Guaycamacuto-class patrol vessel shadowing it at a distance of about 5 nautical miles. That's not standard procedure for a routine patrol. That's an escort. And if you're escorting a submarine near a U.S. carrier strike group, you're not worried about navigation errors, you're making a pas. Fact 2, the Russians were watching. 3 days before the incident, a Russian Yazan-class nuclear submarine, one of the quietest in the world, was detected transiting the Atlantic, heading toward the Caribbean. U.S. Northern Command issued a classified alert, but the public was told nothing. The Yazan didn't approach Venezuelan waters, but its presence was no coincidence. Moscow has been steadily increasing its military cooperation with Caracas, including the deployment of long-range bombers to Venezuela in 2018 and the recent delivery of S-300 air defense systems. The message? Russia is willing to escalate if the U.S. pushes too hard. Fact 3, the Iranians are playing a long game. In the weeks leading up to the incident, Iranian Quds Force operatives were spotted in Caracas, coordinating with Venezuelan intelligence. Their mission? Not just to prop up Maduro, but to establish a permanent Iranian military presence in the Western Hemisphere. The Caribe's maneuver near the Ford wasn't just a Venezuelan gambit, it was a test. A test of US resolve, of NATO's cohesion, and of how far Washington is willing to go to maintain its dominance in its own backyard. Fact 4. The US response was deliberately muted. Here's where it gets really interesting. The Ford Strike Group had every right to force the submarine to submerge or even to escort it out of the area. But it didn't. Why? Because the White House had already decided that this wasn't worth a crisis. Not now, at least. The Biden administration is juggling wars in Ukraine and Gaza, a looming election, and a Republican Party that's itching for a fight with China. A naval standoff with Venezuela, backed by Russia and Iran, was the last thing it needed. But here's the Venezuela knew that. This wasn't a miscalculation. It was a calculated risk, designed to see how far the US could be pushed before it blinked. And that, my friends, is how you lose a superpower's sphere of influence. The broader geopolitical why this matters. Let me put this in perspective. For the last 30 years, the United States has operated under the assumption that it could project military power anywhere in the world without serious pushback. The 1990s were the unipolar moment. America was the sole superpower, and everyone else fell in line. But that era is over. What we're seeing now is the rise of a multipolar world, where Russia, China, and even regional powers like Iran and Venezuela are no longer willing to accept US dominance without a fight. The realist spheres of influence and the new Cold War. From a realist perspective, this incident is a textbook example of great power competition. The US has long considered Latin America its backyard, a sphere of influence where it can intervene at will. But Russia and China have spent the last decade chipping away at that dominance. China's Belt and Road Initiative has made deep inroads in the region, from Argentina to AMA. Russia has positioned itself as the anti-US patron, supplying weapons, intelligence, and diplomatic cover to regimes Washington wants to overthrow. Venezuela is the perfect case study. Sanctioned, isolated, and desperate, it has turned to Moscow and Tehran for survival. And in return, it's offering something a foothold in the Western Hemisphere. A Russian naval base in Venezuela would be a game-changer. An Iranian military presence would force the US to divert resources from the Pacific, where China is the real threat. Historical: the Cuban Missile Crisis, but in reverse. In 1962, the Soviet Union tried to place nuclear missiles in Cuba. The US blockaded the island, and the world came closer to nuclear war than at any point in history. The crisis ended with a secret: the Soviets withdrew their missiles from Cuba, and the US quietly removed its Jupiter missiles from Turkey. This incident is the reverse. The US has been encircling Russia and China for decades. NATO action, AUKUS, the pivot to Asia. Now, Moscow and Beijing are pushing back, not with nuclear weapons, but with asymmetric submarines, drones, cyber warfare, and proxy conflicts. And just like in 1962, the risk of miscalculation is sky high. The Chinese: the Pacific isn't the only theater. Most analysts focus on the South China Sea or Taiwan when discussing US-China tensions. But the Caribbean is just as critical. If China can establish a military presence in Venezuela, even a small one, it forces the US to split its attention. And that's exactly what Beijing wants. A distracted America is a weaker America. Military and strategic: the risks of escalation. Now, let's talk about the military realities. The Ford Strike Group is a floating fortress: F-35s, Aegis destroyers, nuclear-powered submarines. The Venezuelan Cibalo is a relic. On paper, this should have been a non-event. But war isn't fought on paper. The submarine more dangerous than you think. Diesel-electric submarines like the Cibalo are slow, but they're also quiet. In shallow waters, like the Caribbean, they can be nearly undetectable. And while the Ford has advanced sonar, it's not infallible. In 2005, a Chinese Song-class submarine surfaced within torpedo range of the USS Kitty Hawk carrier group. The US didn't detect it until it was too late. The same thing could have happened here. The risk of accidental escalation. Here's the nightmare: the Caribbean surfaces too close to the Ford. A US destroyer, following protocol, locks on with its radar. The Venezuelan crew, icking, fires a torpedo. Or worse, a Russian or Iranian advisor on board decides to make a PUD. The US responds with force. Suddenly, you have a shooting war in the Caribbean. And let's be the US would win that war. But at what cost? Venezuela isn't Iraq or Afghanistan. It's a country with deep ties to Russia, China, and Iran. A US invasion would trigger a proxy conflict that could spill into Colombia, Brazil, and beyond. And in an election year, that's political dynamite. The lessons of Iraqan hubris is a hell of a drug. Remember the cakewalk in Iraq? The mission accomplished banner? The US has a long history of underestimating its adversaries. Venezuela may be weak, but it's not alone. And in a multipolar world, even small players can cause big problems. The domestic political why this is about more than geopolitics. Now, let's talk about the elephant in the US domestic politics. The election. Biden can't afford a crisis. Joe Biden is in a bind. His approval ratings are underwater, inflation is still a problem, and the border crisis is a political liability. The last thing he needs is a naval standoff with Venezuela. But the Republicans are already using this incident to paint him as weak. Marco Rubio called it another example of Biden's failed foreign policy. Lindsey Graham demanded immediate action. And Trump, of course, is already calling for total domination. Biden's team knows this. That's why the response was so muted. They're hoping the story fades before November. But here's the it won't. Because Venezuela, Russia, and Iran aren't going to stop pushing. They see an opportunity, a distracted America, a divided electorate, a president who can't afford a war. And they're going to exploit it. The swing state Florida's Venezuelan vote. Florida is the ultimate swing state, and its Venezuelan American community is a powerful voting bloc. For years, they've been pushing for tougher action against Maduro. But here's the U.S. military intervention in Venezuela would be a disaster for Biden in Florida. Why? Because the Venezuelan diaspora doesn't just want Maduro gone, they want stability. And a war would plunge their homeland into chaos. So Biden is stuck. He can't ignore Venezuela, but he can't risk a war. And that's exactly where Maduro wants him. The deep state, the Pentagon's dilemma. The U.S. military is divided. The Hawks, led by figures like General Laura Richardson, head of Southern Command, want a more aggressive posture. They see Venezuela as a clear and present danger, a Russian-Iranian proxy on America's doorstep. But the realists, like Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin, know that a war in Venezuela would be a quagmire. And then there's the intelligence community. The CIA has been warning for years that Venezuela is becoming a hub for Russian and Iranian operations. But they also know that Maduro is more useful as a thorn in America's side than as a target for regime change. A weak, dependent Venezuela is easier to control than a failed state. Scenario: what comes next? So where do we go from here? Let's game out the possibilities. Scenario 1, the status quo. In this scenario, the U.S. continues its current sanctions, diplomatic pressure, and occasional military exercises in the Caribbean. Venezuela, Russia, and Iran keep probing, but they don't push too hard. The Ford Strike Group rotates out, and the incident fades from memory. Why? It's because no one wants a war. Biden doesn't, Maduro doesn't, and Putin is too busy in Ukraine. Why? It's because it encourages more testing. If Venezuela gets away with this, what's next? A Russian base? An Iranian missile site? Scenario 2, controlled escalation. This is the most likely outcome. The U.S. ramps up pressure, more sanctions, cyber attacks, covert operations, but stops short of military action. Venezuela responds with more: another submarine incident, a drone strike on a U.S. base in Colombia, or a cyber attack on the AMA Canal. Why? It's because both sides have domestic audiences to please. Biden needs to look tough, Maduro needs to look defiant. Why? It's because controlled escalation has a way of spiraling out of control. One misstep, one overreaction, and suddenly you're in a shooting war. Scenario 3, direct conflict. In this scenario, the U.S. launches a limited strike, maybe a cruise missile attack on a Venezuelan military base, or a cyber attack that takes down the power grid. Venezuela, backed by Russia and Iran, retaliates. The US escalates. Before you know it, you have a full-blown crisis. Why? It's because the risks are too high. The US would win, but the cost would be catastrophic. Why? It's because accidents happen. And in a multipolar world, the risk of miscalculation is higher than ever. Grand strategy: the death of liberal hegemony. Let me be: the United States is trying to maintain a global empire it can no longer afford. For decades, America has operated under the doctrine of liberal hegemony, the idea that the US should use its military and economic power to spread democracy, free markets, and American values around the world. It's a noble idea. It's also a fantasy. The pattern of failure. Look at the last 30. $1 trillion war that destabilized the Middle East. 20 years of occupation ended in humiliation. A humanitarian intervention that created a failed state. A proxy war that strengthened Russia and Iran. A noble cause, but one that's draining US resources at a time when China is rising. And now, Venezuela. Another crisis, another distraction, another drain on American power. The British Empire's decline. The British Empire didn't fall because it was defeated in battle. It fell because it overstretched. It tried to control too much, with too little. Sound familiar? The US is making the same mistake. It's trying to contain China in the Pacific, Russia in Europe, and Iran in the Middle East, all while maintaining a global military presence. It's unsustainable. The realist offshore balancing. Here's what the US should be offshore balancing. Instead of trying to control every region, it should focus on preventing any single power from dominating Eurasia. Pulling back from let the Europeans defend themselves. NATO is a relic of the Cold War. Focusing on the Pacific is the only theater that matters. Everything else is a distraction. Engaging with diplomacy, not sanctions. Talk to Russia, talk to Iran, talk to Venezuela. Make deals. But that's not what's happening. Instead, the US is doubling down on a strategy that's already failed. Alternatives and what should be done. So what's the way forward? Here's my prescription, controversial, but necessary. 1. End the sanctions regime. Sanctions don't work. They hurt the people, not the regime. And they push Venezuela into the arms of Russia and Iran. Instead, the US should offer a sanctions relief in exchange for democratic reforms. It's not perfect, but it's better than the status quo. 2. Engage with Russia and Iran. The US needs to talk to its adversaries. Not because they're trustworthy, but because diplomacy is the only way to avoid war. Offer Russia a "you stay out of Latin America, and we'll stay out of Ukraine." Offer Iran a "you stop supporting proxies, and we'll ease sanctions." 3. Strengthen regional alliances. The US should work with Brazil, Colombia, and Mexico to contain Venezuela. Not through military force, but through economic and diplomatic pressure. A united Latin America is the best defense against outside interference. 4. Reduce the military footprint. The Ford Strike Group shouldn't be in the Caribbean. It's a provocation. The US should pull back its military presence and focus on deterrence, not domination. 5. Prepare for the worst. Prepare for the worst. Because if history is any guide, this kind of brinkmanship doesn't end with a diplomatic note or a sternly worded statement. It ends with miscalculation, and miscalculation in the Caribbean, where the US has treated the waters as its own lake since the Monroe Doctrine, is a particularly dangerous game. Let me explain why this matters beyond the immediate headlines. The Venezuelan submarine incident near the USS Gerald or Ford isn't just about one erratic patrol or one overzealous captain. It's a symptom of something far the unraveling of the post-Cold War order in Latin America, and the return of great power competition to a region the US has long taken for granted. For decades, Washington operated under the assumption that the Caribbean was a de facto American sea, where no outside power could challenge its dominance without facing swift and overwhelming consequences. That assumption is now being tested not just by Venezuela, but by Russia, Iran, and, increasingly, China. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't the first time a U.S. carrier strike group has been shadowed in these waters. In 2008, during the brief but tense standoff between Russia and Georgia, the Kremlin sent a pair of Tu-160 strategic bombers on a long-range patrol that included a flyby near the USS Theodore Roosevelt, then operating in the Caribbean. The message was if the US could project power into Russia's near abroad, Russia could do the same in America's. The difference today is that Venezuela, a country with a collapsing economy and a military that can barely keep its own aircraft in the air, is now attempting to play the same game. And that's not confidence, it's desperation. Here's the uncomfortable: Venezuela's regime is not acting out of strength, but out of weakness. Nicolas Maduro knows his country is isolated, his people are starving, and his military is a hollowed-out shell of what it once was. The only way he can maintain any semblance of relevance is by provoking the US and then positioning himself as a victim of American imperialism. It's a classic authoritarian playbook: create an external enemy to distract from internal failures. The problem is that when you're a regime on life support, every provocation carries the risk of miscalculation. And in the age of social media, where every incident is amplified and distorted in real time, the room for error is shrinking. But let's not pretend this is just about Venezuela. The real story here is the return of Russia and Iran as active players in the Western Hemisphere, and the way they're using Caracas as a proxy to bleed the US slowly. Russia has been supplying Venezuela with arms, intelligence, and even cyber capabilities for years. In 2019, Moscow sent 2 nuclear-capable Tu-160 bombers to Venezuela in a show of support, and in 2020, it deployed a contingent of Wagner Group mercenaries to protect Maduro's regime. Iran, meanwhile, has been shipping oil to Venezuela in defiance of US sanctions, and in 2021, the two countries signed a 20-year cooperation agreement that includes military and intelligence sharing provisions. The submarine incident near the ford? That's not just Venezuela acting alone. It's Venezuela acting with the backing of 2 of America's most determined adversaries. So what does this mean for US strategy? The establishment narrative in Washington is that the US needs to double down on its military presence in the region, increase sanctions, and isolate Venezuela further. That's exactly the wrong approach. Sanctions have already failed: they've impoverished the Venezuelan people without toppling the regime, and they've pushed Maduro into the arms of Moscow and Tehran. More military deployments, like the Ford Strike Group, only play into the regime's narrative of American aggression. And isolation? That's a fantasy. Venezuela is already integrated into a network of anti-American alliances, and the more the US tries to cut it off, the more it will rely on those alliances. Here's what should happen instead. First, the US needs to recognize that Venezuela is not an existential threat, it's a nuisance, and a declining one at that. The real threats are Russia and Iran, and the way they're using Venezuela as a platform to project power into the Western Hemisphere. The US should focus on containing those two, not on punishing Caracas. That means engaging with Venezuela's neighbors, Brazil, Colombia, and Mexico, to create a regional bulwark against outside interference. It means offering incentives, not just punishments, to peel Venezuela away from its patrons. And it means accepting that Maduro isn't going anywhere anytime soon, and that the US needs to deal with him as he is, not as Washington wishes him to be. Second, the US needs to rethink its military posture in the region. The Ford Strike Group in the Caribbean is a relic of a bygone era, when the US could afford to project power everywhere at once. Today, with China rising in the Pacific and Russia resurgent in Europe, the US can't afford to treat Latin America as a secondary theater. That doesn't mean abandoning the region, it means shifting from a posture of domination to one of deterrence. The US should maintain a minimal presence, focused on intelligence sharing and rapid response capabilities, rather than permanent carrier deployments that only serve to provoke. Finally, the US needs to accept that the era of unipolarity in Latin America is over. For the first time since the 19th century, outside powers are actively competing for influence in the Western Hemisphere, and the US can no longer assume that its dominance is guaranteed. That doesn't mean the US is losing, it means the game has changed, and Washington needs to adapt. The alternative is a series of escalating crises, each one more dangerous than the last, until one day, a miscalculation leads to something neither side intended. And that's the real risk here. Not that Venezuela will sink the Ford, or that Russia will establish a permanent base in the Caribbean, but that in the fog of great power competition, a small incident spirals into something much larger. The US has spent the last 2 decades fighting wars in the Middle East while its adversaries have been quietly extending their influence in its own backyard. Now, those chickens are coming home to roost. The question is whether Washington will recognize the new reality in time, or whether it will keep doubling down on a strategy that's already failed. Now, what most people don't realize is that this submarine incident isn't just a military blunder, it's a domestic political time bomb for Nicolas Maduro. And that's where things get really interesting, because the Venezuelan regime is far more fragile than it appears from the outside. Let me explain why this matters. Maduro's government has survived sanctions, hyperinflation, mass protests, and even a failed coup attempt in 2019. But survival isn't the same as stability. The Venezuelan state is a hollowed-out shell, propped up by a combination of repression, foreign patronage, and sheer inertia. The economy is a disaster. GDP has contracted by nearly 80% since 2013, oil production has collapsed from 3.5 million barrels per day in the 1990s to barely 700,000 today, and the bolivar is so worthless that people weigh stacks of cash rather than count them. The regime's legitimacy is non-existent, its support base is shrinking, and its only real lifeline is the military, which is itself deeply divided. Here's the uncomfortable: Maduro isn't in control of Venezuela the way Putin is in Russia or Xi is in China. He's more like a mafia boss presiding over a crumbling empire, where loyalty is bought with access to corruption rather than ideology. The submarine incident is a perfect example of this dysfunction. The Venezuelan Navy is a shadow of what it once was, its fleet is aging, its sailors are underpaid, and its command structure is riddled with rivalries. The fact that a submarine, of all things, nearly collided with a US carrier isn't just a military failure, it's a symptom of a regime that can't even coordinate its own armed forces. And that's where the domestic political dimensions come into play. Maduro's survival depends on keeping the military elite happy and preventing any single faction from becoming powerful enough to challenge him. The submarine incident threatens both. If the US responds with increased patrols, sanctions on Venezuelan naval officers, or even a limited cyber attack on the country's already decrepit military networks, it could expose just how weak the regime's control over its own forces really is. Worse, it could force Maduro to make either crack down on the military, risking a backlash from the very institution that keeps him in power, or double down on anti-American rhetoric, which might rally some nationalist support but would also accelerate Venezuela's economic collapse. Now, let's talk about the opposition. For years, the US and its allies have bet on Juan Guaidó as the face of Venezuelan democracy, only to watch him to irrelevance. The problem isn't Guaidó, it's the assumption that regime change in Venezuela would follow the same script as the Cold War-era transitions in Chile or Nicaragua. It won't. The Venezuelan opposition is fragmented, its leadership is in exile, and its base is exhausted. The 2024 presidential election, if it happens at all, will be neither free nor fair. But that doesn't mean Maduro is invincible. The real threat to his rule isn't the opposition, it's the military, and specifically, the mid-level officers who are tired of being poor in a country with so much oil. This is where the submarine incident becomes a potential catalyst. If the US decides to impose targeted sanctions on the Venezuelan Navy's leadership, or if it leaks intelligence about the incident to sow discord within the armed forces, it could accelerate a power struggle. We've already seen this play out before. In 2018, Maduro survived an assassination attempt using drones, but the incident exposed deep divisions within the military. The same year, a group of officers led by Captain Javier Nieto Quintero attempted a mutiny in Caracas. These weren't isolated events, they were signs of a system under stress. The question is whether the US will recognize this opportunity or squander it. The Biden administration has been reluctant to push too hard on Venezuela, fearing that aggressive action could trigger a migration crisis or push Maduro further into Russia's arms. But the submarine incident changes the calculus. It's a reminder that Venezuela isn't just a humanitarian disaster, it's a geopolitical liability. And if the US wants to contain Russian and Chinese influence in the region, it needs to start thinking like a great power again, not a distracted hegemon. So what's the most likely scenario? In the short term, Maduro will use the incident to rally nationalist support, portraying himself as a defender of Venezuelan sovereignty against American imperialism. He'll probably order more military exercises, maybe even a show of force near the maritime border with Guyana, where Venezuela has been making increasingly aggressive claims over the Essequibo region. But this is all theater. The real action will be behind the. In the medium term, the US has it can either double down on containment, using the incident as justification for a more aggressive military posture in the Caribbean, or it can use the moment to open a back channel to the Venezuelan military. The latter is the smarter play. The US has a long history of working with Latin American militaries, even those with blood on their hands. The key is to offer them a way out amnesty for mid-level officers, economic incentives for defectors, and a clear message that the US isn't interested in regime change, just stability. The worst-case scenario is that neither side backs down. If the US responds with more carrier deployments and Maduro retaliates with more provocations, we could see a slow-motion escalation that neither side wants but neither can stop. That's how great powers stumble into wars, not through grand strategy, but through a series of miscalculations and overreactions. And in a region as volatile as Latin America, that's a risk the US can't afford to take. The bottom line is the submarine incident isn't just about two ships nearly colliding. It's about the end of an era in Latin America, where the US could dictate terms and local strongmen had to play by Washington's rules. That era is over. The question now is whether the US will adapt or keep pretending that the old playbook still works. Because if it doesn't, the next incident won't be a near miss, it'll be a direct hit. Now, what most people don't realize is that this incident didn't happen in a vacuum. It's the latest symptom of a much deeper strategic drift in Washington's approach to Latin America. For decades, the US treated the region as a secondary theater, a place where stability was outsourced to local proxies and where military posturing was more about deterring Soviet influence than actually shaping outcomes. That worked when the Soviet Union was the bogeyman, but today, the threats are far more Chinese economic penetration, Russian hybrid warfare, and the rise of homegrown authoritarianism that doesn't need Moscow's blessing to destabilize the hemisphere. The submarine near-miss isn't just a Venezuelan miscalculation, it's a flashing red light that the US has been sleepwalking through a geopolitical transition it refuses to acknowledge. Let me explain why this matters beyond the immediate headlines. The Gerald R. Ford isn't just a carrier, it's a $13 billion floating symbol of American power projection, and its deployment to the Caribbean was meant to send a message. But messages only work if the recipient is listening. Maduro's regime isn't listening because it's operating under a different set of incentives. Venezuela's economy is a smoking ruin, its people are fleeing by the millions, and its military is the only institution keeping the regime afloat. In that context, a near collision with a US carrier isn't a mistake, it's a calculated gamble. Maduro knows the US doesn't want a war, so he's testing how far he can push before Washington blinks. And so far, the answer pretty damn far. Here's the uncomfortable: the US has no coherent strategy for Venezuela because it's still fighting the last war. The establishment narrative in Washington treats Maduro like a pariah, which he is, but also like a temporary problem that will solve itself if we just wait long enough. That's magical thinking. The reality is that Venezuela is a failed state with a nuclear-armed patron and a deep-pocketed investor who see it as a beachhead in the Western Hemisphere. The US can't contain Venezuela the way it contained Cuba during the Cold War because the geopolitical landscape has changed. Back then, the US had economic leverage, a united regional front, and a clear ideological enemy. Today, Latin America is fragmented, China is writing checks, and Russia is playing the spoiler. The old playbook doesn't just need updating, it needs a complete rewrite. So what are the alternatives? The first option is the one the Biden administration seems to be leaning more of the same. That means maintaining sanctions, supporting Juan Guaido's ghost government, and hoping that economic pressure will eventually force Maduro to the negotiating table. It's a strategy that hasn't worked in 6 years, but it's politically safe because it doesn't require hard choices. The problem is that time isn't on Washington's side. Every month that passes, China deepens its ties with Caracas, Russia extends its military footprint, and Venezuela's crisis spills over into Colombia, Brazil, and the Caribbean. The longer the US waits, the more it cedes the initiative to its rivals. The second option is what I'd call the realist reset. This would involve acknowledging that Maduro isn't going anywhere anytime soon and that the US needs to engage with the regime not because it likes it, but because the alternative is worse. That doesn't mean lifting sanctions or recognizing Maduro's legitimacy. It means opening back channels to the Venezuelan military, offering conditional sanctions relief in exchange for concessions on oil exports, and working with regional partners like Brazil and Mexico to create an off-ramp for the regime. The goal wouldn't be to save Maduro but to stabilize Venezuela enough to prevent a complete collapse. It's not pretty, but it's better than the status quo. The third option is the high-risk, high-reward limited military intervention to secure Venezuela's oil infrastructure and create a humanitarian corridor. I'm not talking about a full-scale invasion, that would be a disaster. But a targeted operation to seize key oil facilities in the Orinoco Belt, combined with a naval blockade to cut off Russian and Iranian arms shipments, could change the calculus in Caracas. The risk, of course, is that it could also trigger a wider conflict, draw in Cuba and Nicaragua, and turn Venezuela into a quagmire. But if the US is serious about preventing a Chinese or Russian military base in the Caribbean, this might be the only way to do it. Now, I know what some of you are. This is just another case of American overreach. Why can't the US just leave Venezuela alone? That's a fair question, but it ignores the fact that Venezuela is already a battleground for great power competition. China has invested billions in Venezuela's oil sector, Russia has sent Wagner Group mercenaries to train the Venezuelan military, and Iran has used Venezuela as a hub for its proxy networks. If the US walks away, it's not just ceding Venezuela, it's ceding the entire Caribbean to its rivals. And that's a strategic blunder of historic proportions. The bottom line is that the submarine incident near the Gerald Ford wasn't an isolated event. It was a warning shot. The question is whether Washington will heed it or keep pretending that the rules of the game haven't changed. If the US wants to avoid a direct confrontation down the line, it needs to start thinking like a power that's serious about defending its interests, not just in Venezuela, but across the hemisphere. That means accepting that containment alone won't work, that engagement doesn't have to mean capitulation, and that sometimes, the only way to prevent a war is to prepare for one. Let me leave you with this thought. In 1962, the US and the Soviet Union nearly went to war over Cuba. The crisis was resolved because both sides had clear red lines and a willingness to negotiate. Today, we're in a similar moment, but with one crucial: the US doesn't seem to know where its red lines are. Maduro is probing, China is advancing, and Russia is meddling. If Washington doesn't wake up soon, the next near miss won't be a submarine and a carrier, it'll be a missile and a city. And by then, it'll be too late to ask whether we should have seen it coming.